Let's review the archery in the Odyssey. Christopher Nolan's take on the ancient Greek epic The Odyssey has been out for a couple of weeks now, and I have had a lot of requests to have a look at how the bows and arrows are used in that film. And as an archer myself, specialising in trick shots and fantasy-style archery, I have some opinions. I actually went to see the film the day after it first released, and I've got to say, I left the cinema feeling a little bit let down. So today I'm going to break down the archery, talk about the things that I liked, the things that I didn't like, and some of the things that I would have done differently. Quick introduction for those of you who don't know me yet. I am Bluminek. I'm a content creator, an archer, an instructor, and a consultant. And in addition to the videos you'll see on my channel, I also do shows and performances and teach workshops specializing in trick archery, fantasy styles, speed shooting, and a lot of the things I'm going to talk about today. Now, before we get started, there are a few disclaimers that I want to make, and the first major one is that I do not recommend watching this video unless you have already seen Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. This is going to be a critical breakdown. I'm going to talk about things, there's going to be spoilers, and more importantly, I don't want to shadow your enjoyment and opinions on the film with my own, right? There's no point watching somebody talking about things they like and don't like about something, and then going away to watch it yourself with that in mind. Watch it first, clean, and then come back and watch this. And in the meantime, here's a quick word from our sponsors, FlexiSpot. Please watch it if you can. Sponsors like this are one of the main reasons that I'm able to continue making these videos, and I'm hugely grateful to them for it. Bum, bum, bum. Do you want to know how to get absolutely shredded? This desk has nothing to do with that because I've only had it for a couple of months, but I do genuinely really like it. Anyone who's ever been in a video call with me or watched me play games on the internet will know that I do not like sitting still. Parkour! And while my job is generally perfect for that, there are some times when I actually need to stay in one place and do some admin. And when that happens, it's fantastic to have a desk that's got as much get up and go as I do, so that I can have a little bit of fun when I get the urge to move. And the FlexiSpot E7 Pro is brilliant for that. With a range of heights that goes from up here to down there, and a standing weight limit of almost 3 Blumineks, I can put whatever I want on it and still be able to adjust the height as much as I need to do the job. So whether your goal is to be more active or slowly drive your co-workers insane by increasing the height of your desk by a tiny amount every day over the course of several months, head to the link in the description and use the code to get $30 extra off your own FlexiSpot E7 standing desk before I disappear off the top of the frame. And we're back. And you're back. Have you seen the film? Excellent. There are one or two other things I want to discuss before we get started to measure expectations. Firstly, I am aware that bashing the Odyssey has become something of an international pastime, which is only to be expected because of how big and successful and popular this film is. It's always going to have people detracting from it, and it's always going to have people like me coming and adding their commentary. I don't want to just do this for the sake of it, so my specialism is archery, and that is what I'm going to mostly talk about. I don't really want to get too far into the weeds on anything else, although I can't promise to not share my 2 pence on a couple of points. Secondly, I know that in the past I have discussed the historical accuracy of the clothing and armor in this film. I did it briefly for a short, and I'm not really going to go over that again too much. We've established at this point that this is not a film that is aiming for accuracy to the time period in which it's set, and is based more on a kind of modern interpretation through a historical lens. Therefore, I don't care, and in fact I quite like the amount of, for instance, diversity involved in this film. It's set in the Mediterranean, which had trade links with North Africa and the Middle East and all sorts of different areas where people would have different skin colors. Please don't come here and be racist in my comments. I'm not here for it. Thirdly, which I probably should have said before secondly, this is going to feature some opinions. These are my opinions. They are not necessarily undisputable fact, and in very many cases are not fact in any kind of way at all. They are feelings. If you absolutely love this film and you are not interested in hearing anyone else's feelings on it, and you do not want to see it criticized, please don't watch this video. Likewise, if you hate this film and you think it can do no right, and you don't want to hear anyone say any positive things about it, please don't watch this video. And whether you agree with anything I say or disagree with it, please be nice in the comments, both to me and to each other. So, first off the bat, as I said before, I left this film feeling disappointed about the way it portrayed archery. There are lots of things that I liked about the film, there are lots of things I thought were cool about the tone, there were other things I didn't, but the archery specifically, I felt let down by. And some of that is a me problem. I am a specialist, this is my passion, and naturally it's going to be hard to live up to that. But if any film was going to live up to it, this is the one. Odysseus is one of the most important and most iconic archers in Western mythology. The bow isn't just some trinket, it's an important plot device. And in the film, it still is. It's referenced early on, it's used later on. All of the iconic scenes, like the 12 axes, like the stringing of the bow, are featured. So I don't think it's completely unreasonable of me to expect a decent level of proficiency shown on screen. Now, I'm not a stickler for these kind of things. I don't want everyone to look like an Olympic level archer, and in fact, I'd prefer it if they don't, because there's a whole bunch of different styles that we use throughout history. But the job of actors and films is to portray someone who has abilities that they personally don't have. And there were definitely times where it felt like this film and the character of Odysseus in particular didn't live up to the level of proficiency that we are told that he has. Right, let's talk ancient Greek archery. This is kind of a background to a lot of what I'm discussing, but it's also very relevant to some of the things that I liked and didn't like about the way that archery is shown in this film. The main thing to bear in mind is that ancient Greek archery does not look like modern Western European archery. So the kind of draw style where you have the arrow on one side of the bow, you have your hand on the other side, you've got 3 fingers on it in a Mediterranean draw, as it's now known, and you're drawing back like this to your cheek or to your eye or even to your chin, is not what ancient Greek archery looked like, at least as far as we can tell. Archery throughout history has been pretty varied, and a lot of the time people who developed a particular technique while hunting and were relatively untrained would have still engaged in military archery. So some leeway for variability is pretty standard for me. But what we often see in ancient Greek archery is that they drew to the chest, frequently at a kind of draw like this, and the way they held the bow varied massively. There was something called a pinch draw, which with this particular bow, I simply am not getting all the way back to the chest. This is a 45-pound bow, and it's very hard with any kind of power in the bow to just pinch the back of an arrow and pull it to there and have some accuracy with it. There's also some variations on that pinch draw that allowed them to put a little bit more power in it. There's one where the index finger wraps slightly underneath the string like this, and then you add the middle finger in, and you are able to draw, therefore, much more easily back to here and get your shot with a much greater amount of power. And then there's also a variation where all the fingers are wrapped around the bottom like this. We assume the thumb is still pinching at the back, and the draw comes back and you make the shot. And this version can be done with a much, much heavier bow and much more powerful draw. And I think that someone in the making of this film knew about this, because we frequently see characters drawing the bow to their chest rather than to their face, and we frequently see them holding the arrow kind of like this. I haven't got very many clips that I can show you, but there's this image of Matt Damon right after releasing an arrow where it looks like he's kind of held it in this style. You can see I'm kind of pinching the back of the arrow here. It's just enough to get slightly more draw on it, and then he's shot like that, right? But there's a problem. Because for people who aren't familiar with archery, just grabbing and pinching the back of the arrow is a very common thing that people try when they don't know what they're doing. And because the bows generally used as props in films are very lightweight to avoid injuring the actors and to avoid, accidentally launching a projectile, then a very simple and poor technique that wouldn't actually give you any power can still be used to mime the shot. And that is what I saw when I was watching this film. I saw people using bows in a way that didn't look comfortable and familiar, and was using a technique that I only normally see when people just don't know what they're doing. And this was made worse by the fact that some of the actors, I'm pretty sure, have used a bow in a more common modern style where they draw to the face with 3 fingers. And several times both Matt Damon and some of the other actors that use a bow, such as John Bernthal, were seen holding the arrow like this on the string or drawing to their face and kind of alternating between these different styles at different points, which again is a thing you can do if you know what you're doing. If I am feeling super confident and I want to get a fast shot off like this, but then I want to do a more aimed shot up here, then I will do that over the course of a few different maneuvers or something like that when I'm skirmishing. But because everyone seems just that little bit less comfortable and familiar with the equipment, they're holding it in ways that kind of implies that they don't fully understand how to get power out of it, and they look a little bit amateurish, then those differences in technique don't come across as deliberate switch-ups and changes, and it looks more like different muscle memory kicking in from different maybe films they've worked on in the past, different styles of archery that they've been taught. And I want to particularly highlight the final scene where Odysseus puts himself in a room full of people and attempts to take them all out with a bow. He has positioned himself in there because he is confident that he has the skill to do this, and I think it's super crucial that that comes across in the way that he looks and moves and acts. And there were ways in which I did not feel that that was met. But before I get into that, let's discuss the things that happened first. The first is stringing the bow. For those of you who don't know about it, you cannot keep a bow with the string under tension for long periods of time and expect it to not gradually weaken or get damaged. So when you're not using one, you take the tension off and you store it with a loose string. And then when you do want to use it, you put the tension back on again and you're good to go. In both the film and the original mythology, this is used as a really important establishing scene for Odysseus because he has a bow that nobody else can string. People have different opinions on the reason why this is, but there are a couple of things that we know about the bow in particular. The first is that it is not a Greek bow. He has got this bow from a long line of people, but originally it comes from Scythia. And Scythia was a different culture from ancient Greece, and they used a different style of bow. And while most ancient Greek bows had a fairly characteristic D-shaped curve, the Scythian bows had a more complex curve shape, not completely unlike this, although this is Chinese in style. But I'm using this one because it is the same shape approximately as the one used in the film. And the particularly relevant thing about this shape is that it means that the ends of the bow, when it's not strung, go this way, but when you string it, they need to go this way. And that makes it a lot harder to string. Even for a very lightweight bow of that shape, getting the string onto it without it spinning around in your hand or slipping out of your grip can be very fiddly for someone who doesn't know what they're doing. But Odysseus's bow wasn't a lightweight thing, or at least it probably wasn't. As far as we know, the ancient Greeks did not use war bows that were of the same kind of draw weight as the ones used in, say, feudal Japan or medieval Europe. And one of the more obvious bits of evidence we have for this is that this partial chest draw is really difficult to do with a bow that has a heavy draw, even if you could otherwise draw it fairly comfortably. But, and while I don't like this interpretation particularly, I do have to point out that Odysseus is a main character in a mythology. He is blessed by the gods, or at least favoured by some of them and hated by others. He is also, as a king, an ancient Greek king in a legend, he is descended from gods. It's entirely possible that the intent behind the stringing of the bow is just that he is supernaturally strong. But I don't like that interpretation for a couple of reasons. The first is that Odysseus's intelligence is mentioned way more often than his strength. And the second is that that reverse curve of his bow is specifically described in the original story. These would have been rare bows, but they were known at the time. They would have been especially rare in Odysseus's day. And I really like the idea that Odysseus, as one of the only people in his culture at the time to have used a bow like this, and also being very strong, has a kind of war weight bow that is just really difficult to string without the right technique. And he's the only person that has ever learned that technique. Or at least if anyone else did, they didn't make it back from that war. The other people attempting to string the bow are the suitors. They are the people who were left behind. They were not soldiers, they did not go to war, they did not have military training, and they would not have traveled and come across these, at the time, what were considered exotic bows, and learned the technique and the skill required to string them. I live in the north of England, and the cinema near me doesn't actually have an IMAX screen, so when I watched it, I couldn't actually see what was going on at the bottom of the screen when he was stringing the bow. It might have been clearer in IMAX, but all I was getting every time was a visual of someone holding the end of the bow and placing the string on it, or not, if they were struggling. But one thing I did notice that I thought was quite cool was that when Odysseus was playing dumb and hadn't yet revealed himself, he did at one point very obviously try and bend the bow in the opposite direction. This is a very common thing for people that aren't used to this shape of bow, because a bow that doesn't have this kind of curve would just be strung like this. And then you'd call it a day, job done. And I really like the interpretation that some of these suitors would have done something like that, because anytime I present a bow to someone that is this shape and I ask them to string it, which I do sometimes in my stage shows, there's about a 50% chance they'll put the string on backwards. And the problem with that is that it does this, because the notches aren't actually in place and the string can just slide off. But there's another thing I need to talk about with the stringing scene, and that is what Odysseus does immediately afterwards. Both in a flashback where he's shown to string the bow before a hunt, and in the final confrontation itself, immediately after putting the string on, he kind of announces his presence by plucking the string, and it makes this big, deep, resonant noise. This ties into one of my complaints about the bows in this film, which is that, my God, were they noisy. Every single time someone draws back a bow or tries to bend it or does anything with it, they go. Every single time an arrow is shot, it goes. And every time it hits something, it goes. I don't know how much of this is a kind of war is hell metaphor, where it's trying to make an analogy for the terror of modern warfare. But just as a frame of reference, this bow has a draw weight of around 120 pounds at max draw, so it's pretty chonky. And when it's shot, it sounds like this. That said, that characteristic hum that you get when Odysseus plucks the string of his bow is incredibly cool. And because it becomes part of the soundtrack as well when it's plucked, it's hard to tell how much of that is a sound that people around Odysseus hear in exactly that way, and how much of that is a metaphor. It is a filmmaking technique that is used to create a moment, and it does very effectively. I've seen a lot of people talking about how it's essentially dry firing the bow to pull back the string and release it without an arrow on. I have thoughts on that, and my thought on that is that whatever. Dry firing is a really bad thing, and you should not do it. If I'm going to draw this bow back and put any amount of force into it, and I release that without an arrow on the string, all of that force has to go somewhere. It no longer has any mass to push, so it goes back into the limbs of the bow, into my own limbs. I've seen people dislocate a shoulder doing this. I've seen people shatter a bow doing this. Somebody like Odysseus would not do that. But grabbing the string and going like that doesn't really put very much energy into it at all. Certainly no more than you'd really get when you shoot a bow at full draw, even with an arrow on it. Going back into the bow and into your joints. I have no issue with it because it is a really cool characteristic, and again, kind of metaphorical thing. It also ties into a running theme of Odysseus in this story, which is his ego. He plucks the string to alert creatures to his presence when he's hunting, people to his presence, to announce who he is. And there are several other points throughout the story where he makes a choice which is very much influenced by an inability to put his ego aside for the sake of achieving his goals. But that's a really minor thing. The slight extra amount in the draw isn't a major problem. It's only a big issue for archery nerds. It doesn't really affect the coolness of the scene. So whatever. He draws it back a little bit far because it's a lightweight prop bow, so it is kind of getting towards dry fire territory. But I don't think that's the intent. And again, this kind of just ties into another complaint that it felt like Matt Damon in particular was quite unfamiliar with the props that he was working with and the way that they should have been worked. The bigger thing that happens, and the most iconic thing that he does with a bow, is the reason that I've got these axes set up here. He shoots through 12 axes. Some of you will have seen a video in the past where I talked about the holes in axes at the time. In the ancient Greek Mycenaean period, it was pretty common for axes to have a hole in the blade. And in the story, in the original book, there is a word that is used, that he shoots through the eye of these axes. And in a lot of modern translations, the eye is translated as the socket, which is to say that if you take an axe off of its handle, the socket sits like this, and if they were all hammered into a bit of wood and lined up, you could try and shoot through that. One of the things that someone who specializes in this period of history has told me is that axes would probably have been stored without the haft quite often, because if you just store the bronze, it can be kept in storage for a lot longer and in different conditions than what you'd need to store it in with the wood. And as the wood dries out over time in storage, the hafts will change size. And so they might not actually be properly fitted by the time you bring them back out, and they would probably have been stored like this. It also solves the problem of having a whole bunch of weapons in the room in which Odysseus has supposedly trapped a bunch of people without weapons, but we'll discuss that later. However, what would you call this hole in an axe if not an eye? And a lot of the axes of the time period didn't have a full and complete socket. The blade would be riveted directly onto a haft. Some of the axes definitely did have sockets. Some of them would have multiple, which then compounds the way that sort of 12 axis thing works. It becomes a little bit less specific, but if we assume that it is the eye of the axe, the hole in the blade, it not only allows us to include a really cool, important detail about historical axes, and I know that the filmmakers knew about this because there are some axes of this design on the wall when the weapons are being stored. But it also solves one of the other problems, which is that if you take 12 really tiny holes like this and you line them up next to each other and then you shoot an arrow through them, or you shoot an arrow just next to them, somebody watching cannot tell. Like it looks really cool with slow-mo footage, or if you can get a camera on the other end of it, but to a person, to a human being watching this in a room, there's an axe over there on the stump, here's an arrow, here's a shot. Did that go through? Did it not? It sounds like it hit something, but I legitimately couldn't tell you whether I succeeded in making that shot. But if you do it with something like this, there are much thicker borders around the edge. If you miss by a little bit, you smack into the axe, you dent it, you shatter your arrow. It's not a safe spectator sport, but it's a lot more obvious when someone succeeds or fails. But the version in the film is neither of those. Instead, you've got 12 axes arranged into 6 crosses, and the arrow passes down the middle here, like this. Now, there are a few things that I don't like about this. One is that it kind of just isn't how it's described in the story. The second is that it looks a lot easier. The third is that I don't really know how you set this up. I've done it with plastic axes and I've shoved arrows in the ground and taped them to the arrows to stop them falling over. It looks like in the film there are some holes in the ground they've been slotted into, but unless those holes are an incredibly tight fit, the weight of an axe head, a double-headed axe head, is going to be so top heavy that even it's just not really going to want to stay upright most of the time, and lining them up is going to be a nightmare. Now, I can see why it's done, because it allows for having them tied together and slotted in the ground, allows for you to have the axes in the room without them in theory registering as weapons, because they are restrained and tied up, while still allowing them to be used later in the scene for a bit of a brawl and getting them involved in a fight. But the more I think about it, the more this actually fits with the way I like to portray Odysseus. This gap here is deceptive. It looks reasonably big, it looks reasonably doable. But you don't have to shoot through this gap. You've got to shoot through the one that's over there. But it's more than that. If I just took a triangle of this size and I went and put it on a target down at that end, I'd be able to hit that reasonably consistently, and a modern day recurve archer would be able to hit it pretty much every time. But Odysseus's bow isn't a modern day recurve bow. It's certainly not a modern day compound bow. A traditional bow does not have a cutout in the center of it. The arrow does not sit central on the bow. It sits skewed at an angle. If I line the string and the bow up here directly towards the camera, like that, you can see this arrow is not lined up directly towards the camera, it's off to the side. And what traditional bows rely on is the fact that the arrow, even this stiff one for shooting from a heavy bow, can bend. And that slight amount of bend combined with a heavy point on the front causes the arrow to flex around the bow, wobble in the air, the fletchings catch the air, it stabilizes, and then it flies straight. But that doesn't happen initially. Initially, it comes out at a bend and it wobbles. And if you send something wobbling like this through a gap like that, there are pretty good odds it is going to smack something on the way through one of those. And the moment it does hit something on the way through, it's going to get derailed, it's going to fly off, it's going to hit one of the axes, it's going to completely exit the whole setup. You have to be very precise, not just with your aim, but with how clean your shot is. And again, this is an Odysseus deceptive trick. This bow that he's given people to do this challenge with is an unfamiliar bow. Even if they've managed to string it, they have never shot this bow in their life, and they're now doing a high precision shot. And you cannot just pick up a bow and know all its idiosyncrasies the first time you shoot it. It is always going to take a little bit of getting used to. This is a trick. And even if you do know how to shoot it, accounting for that wobble in the arrow at short distance is not something that any archer really often has to do. These kind of short range, close room, narrow tunnel shots are rare, and they exist throughout history as a test to see how clean somebody's release is and how smooth they can make that shot. There's another version of this which was done more often that is called darb shooting, which was used in the Ottoman Empire, and it consists of taking a drinking glass and shooting the bottom of the glass out without shattering the sides. It works on the same principle. You've got to be precise, and your arrow has to be flying completely straight by the time it goes through there. You also, for a heavy bow, need to have enough strength to draw the bow back far enough that it is flying on a relatively flat trajectory. If I can't draw this bow very far, and I try to aim through a tunnel, and that arrow curves down like that, over that distance, it's not going to make it. And there's a third thing, which I only discovered when I started trying to do this. When you try and aim that down a narrow tunnel, you can't look down the tunnel. If I aim this shot by looking down that tunnel, the shot will go, as I've drawn to here, the arrow is slightly down there, the shot will go about there. Even if it later would have met the center, it's going to hit something on the way through. I have to look at the axe and trust that my body is in the right position. And if you've not had a chance to try that trick before, you're not going to get that first time. But I have had a chance to try this trick before. I did a video about this. I did this setup because I was sponsored by the Odyssey. So I'm going to see if I can do it again, so that the arrows as they come through will get stopped by something, and I will try and film this in slow-mo so that even if you can't quite tell what's happened, we can play it back. And I'm going to do this as close to the film as I can. I'm going to take a recurved bow, a traditional style of bow that has a heavy draw. This is around 120 pounds at full draw. I'm going to string it up, I'm going to twang the string, and I'm going to give it a shot. Let's do it again from a different angle. So yeah, look, I probably wouldn't have won Penelope's hand or anything, but it's a doable shot for someone who knows the trick, and I like that idea. But the problem with this in the film is that nobody explains any of this, and to an audience that isn't familiar with the wobble of the arrow, and even to me, who is, it looks like a fairly easy shot. Which, for the story that's being told, is kind of fine. Odysseus' identity has already been proved at this point. The shot itself is sort of an afterthought. It's a bridge that gets from one scene to another in the way that this is being told. It's less of a climactic moment because we've already had that, and it's a setup for the next moment where he starts to lay waste to everybody in the room. And that is where my real complaint comes in. Okay, a bit of context here from me. I flippin' love cool archery. I'm not just here to break down scenes, I'm not just here to hate on stuff. I watched Lord of the Rings with my little heart eyes the whole time because everything that Legolas does looks incredibly cool. Films are not made like Lord of the Rings anymore. They don't have the entire cast on set for several years, training all of the background skills that they needed, and it shows. But it's not that long ago that we had films like John Wick with incredible choreography that made it, if not believable, then at least incredibly cool to watch a single person lay waste to a whole room full of enemies. And Matt Damon was Jason Bourne, and Christopher Nolan directed the Batman films. So why, for the love of Athena, why does Odysseus, a man who is so skilled with a bow and so confident in his own skill with a bow that he has intentionally maneuvered a situation where he has to face 30 unarmed people with only a bow and arrows. A man who is repeatedly praised in the film and the original story for his tactical genius. A man who, like 2 scenes previously, has fought like 7 armed swordsmen at close quarters with no weapon and looked reasonably convincing. Why does he approach this fight by taking an arrow, placing it on the bow, shooting somebody, leaving the rest of the arrows in a quiver on the ground, and then sort of staggering around the room, staring as everybody runs about, in the complete open, not hiding behind anything, not using the cover of darkness, not doing anything cool, and then slowly, awkwardly setting up his next arrow and shooting again. We see him at a couple of times, and I cannot stress this enough, go back to the quiver where he's left the arrows instead of taking them in his hand and having them ready to shoot people with. And I know that someone in that film knew what they were doing and had some cool choreography ideas. We see him use the bow in close quarters, which is a terrible idea with a real bow, but his bow has been established to be really unusually strong. He occasionally takes 2 arrows out so that he can make 1, 2 shots in reasonably quick succession. But all of these cool moves are undermined by the fact that Matt Damon as Odysseus does not look comfortable holding that bow. He's got this awkward stagger going on. He looks panicked. Every time there's a zoom in on his face, he doesn't look like a man who is in control of a situation and exacting his revenge. Even before anything goes wrong, he looks scared. And when he does his shots, he's very, very awkwardly shoots like this. And then there's like a little bit of time where he's looking down at the shot and going again, instead of the kind of confident assuredness of somebody that's done this kind of thing before. And this might sound like I'm being really harsh on Matt Damon, but I promise I'm not, because I don't actually think this is his fault. In a film, when you run an action scene, you have a lot of chances to get things right. You have a lot of takes, you get to do things lots of times, and if things aren't working out, you have a lot of chances to change them. You have stunt doubles. You should have, if you're doing archery, you should have a stunt double somewhere on site who can move with a bow in a comfortable way, who can go straight from draw to shot, who can do those movements familiarly, and you should be able to swap them in. But I've seen Matt Damon talking about this in interviews, and he expressed that he was uncomfortable with the bow, that he was having to practice at home on the sofa because Christopher Nolan didn't allow him to use stunt doubles in certain scenes. But he was practicing on his own on the sofa, which means that they don't seem to have had somebody there training him. He's not had an archery coach on a regular basis, which is ridiculous, because there's a completely unnecessary shirtless scene in the film in which it's made clear that the man is absolutely shredded. And if, as a film, a production, or an individual actor, you have the time and the money to sink into giving someone an 8-pack, you can get them to do physical training that incorporates the motions of their character's craft. This bow has a 45-pound draw. If I want to get repeated reps in, it is going to take some energy every single time I make a shot, and that is going to build up as exercise. And if you can get your actor to gradually increase their strength, to use more powerful bows, and then not only is that a part of their workout regime that is getting them fit, but they're building strength and familiarity with their character's equipment. And they're also learning what it feels like to draw a bow with power in it, so that they can take a lighter prop and make it look like it's got that same amount of force. But even if you don't have the time and coaching to get your actor to be really comfortable with their equipment, and even if you've made a choice to not include stunt doubles in certain scenes so the actor can do their thing, there are still ways to make them look a lot more confident. One of the things that a lot of the MCU films do is they don't use any real arrows. The actor just goes like this, and they make the shot with a bow that they can, dry fire without it being a problem, and the arrow is CGI'd in afterwards. And while that has its own problems, one of the things that it does do is it stops that awkward fumbling, and it means the character always looks like they can get the arrow onto the string really quickly and really smoothly. Depending on how you shoot the scene, you can make them look competent without really ever showing them doing very much. You can show a shot of them drawing an arrow, and then a shot from a different angle of them making the shot. You can go from here to here. And I get it. Christopher Nolan is not an action movie director, and this was not an action movie. This was not John Wick. It was not The Bourne Identity. But it was kind of a survival horror film. And one of the things you could absolutely and probably should do with someone like Odysseus is make that a survival horror scene. But it's not Odysseus's horror. It's the suitors. Think of it like Batman. Nolan has directed a Batman series. He knows how this works. You don't tend to put Batman in a room full of people that's brightly lit and have him fight them all in the middle of the room. You tend to put Batman in a room where he can use darkness and shadows and space to his advantage. And Odysseus has had time to prep for this fight. This is his territory. This is his palace. He's got his son there who could very easily snuff out a bunch of fires or something quickly once everything kicks off. He's got himself and his knowledge of the space. He has no excuse to stand in the middle of the room and let everybody gradually run up to him as they build their confidence. He should be coming from the shadows. He should disappear 2 seconds into that fight and everybody's wondering where he is, and then an arrow flies out of nowhere and stabs somebody. You don't even need an actor who's competent, you just need some really cool cinematography, and half of that fight scene just looks badass as hell as people are scared, they don't know what's happening, and an arrow flies out of the darkness and another one is down. And you can see them getting more and more tense and more scared as the fight goes on, until then eventually something else happens that breaks that pattern and it forces him into the open where he has to fight. That is an Odysseus who is good at tactics. That is an Odysseus who has planned for this fight. That is a man who has a reasonable expectation that he is going to win against 30 unarmed people with a bow when he's only got about a dozen arrows in the first place. And I understand that the suitors are incompetent, but you don't need to make Odysseus equally incompetent in order to level the scales somehow. Now, does this mean that this is a terrible film because that one scene isn't quite as dramatic as I thought it should have been? God no. That's just one scene. There's a whole ass film, and there's a whole lot of things to like. There's a whole lot of storytelling that goes on. There's a lot of emotional depth. There's also some other stuff that maybe was a little bit on the nose for people that are vaguely familiar with such concepts as, say, the Bronze Age. But I'm not a full-on film critic. I'm an archer, and I specialize in this kind of stuff. I've worked on sets where we've done some stunt archery. I've done things like this on a smaller scale. I know what it looks like. And I know that there are a lot of opportunities, there are a lot of people that go into making something like this, and it only takes somebody to not take the whole thing seriously, who's high up the chain, for it to have a much less cool effect than it could have done. Ultimately, whether or not you enjoy the Odyssey as a film is going to depend hugely on what you're expecting to get out of it. If you are coming into this with a lot of love for the source material and some specific expectations of how you want to see things done, let's be honest, you're probably not going to get that. Best will in the world, there is no way to adapt something as well known as the Odyssey in a way that is going to make everybody happy. But if you are making a film, if you're involved anywhere in the process and you are including a character with a bit of weaponry that they are internationally and historically famous for being good at, make sure your actor has time to get good with that equipment, and make sure your actor has somebody who knows what they're doing to teach them how to get good with that equipment. And make sure you have stunt people that you are using to their fullest potential who also are good with that equipment. And failing all of that, choreograph the scene and stage the scene in a way where those shortcomings aren't very obvious. So anyway, that's my breakdown. That's how I feel about the archery, and those are the things that I would change. But I do hope that you've found this interesting, whether it's from the historical perspectives, the storytelling comparisons, or me prattling about, talking about my dream way of filming a particular scene. If you like this kind of film breakdown and comparison, then please let me know, and I will try and do more of them. If I film this when my wife's home, then we might be able to throw in some stunt sequences and things that we can choreograph on the fly. And lastly, before I go, I want to thank all of my patrons for making this stuff possible and humoring me in the less thought out version of this rant that I did a while back. Thank you so much to everyone I've messaged to ask questions about this scene and the various stuff so that I could stop second guessing myself and realize that I had remembered things correctly. Thank you especially to Jenna for getting hold of some clips for me that I could use to analyze. That was way above and beyond, and I really appreciate it. And as always, take care, be good to each other, and I'll see you on the next video.